Yeah, I've been having some problems with Pal Talk. I keep getting disconnected under the Nick Jacobs trouble. So I just want to make sure that ET from Iowa. Hi, welcome. Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, I just want to make sure that there's no problem there with the audio. All right, welcome everyone. Tonight, Lord willing, I'd like to share some verses. We want to try and focus on the 2,300 days. 2,300 days that we read about in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14, I believe. This study is somewhat of a review. Another study called The Days Are Shortened. I think some of these verses may repeat. But I think it's better going back and just double checking, making sure, Lord willing, that we might still have consistency when it comes to how these verses come together. So what are we talking about? 2,300 days. Is that literal or is that spiritual? What do you think? Bishop Keith, hi, welcome to the room. Is that literal or spiritual? Yeah, I knew that was coming. You're welcome to stay in the room, but if you're going to disrupt the room, then we're gonna have to bounce you. It is spiritual. Well, what about the numbers that we see on the calendar? Does that have anything to do with? Hold on one second. Does that have anything to do with? I agree with you, Gregory, that it is spiritual, but I think we have to look at it from every possible angle, right, Lord willing, to see whether or not there is consistency. So I'll try to offer some information there as well. Okay, so Daniel chapter 8 verse 13. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily? Here's the other part of the verse. Concerning the daily and the transgression of desolation, to give both a sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. So I think what's important here perhaps is to first to try and establish the context. What does it mean to be trodden underfoot? What are we looking at here with this language? That the sanctuary is going to be trodden underfoot. Wouldn't that be talking about 7,000? Hi, welcome. Wouldn't that be talking about the Great Tribulation? Jeremiah chapter 12 verse 10. Many pastors have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion underfoot. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. So looking at the context of Daniel 8 verse 13 and also verse 14, I think we might agree that there God has in view the judgment that comes on the body of Christ in tribulation. Does that make sense? So trodden underfoot, I offer here, it does relate to the Great Tribulation, and it transitions into the day of the Lord, separation of wheat and tares. That's surprising? Not to me it isn't, because a lot of other areas that we've looked at seems to be coming back to the same picture. It is God's judgment on the church that begins at the house of God with the chastening of the elect and transitioning into the separation of wheat and tares. So the Lord have trodden underfoot all my mighty men. What about Luke 21 verse 24? They shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. Right? Again, the time when God, I believe, he gives the body over. He hides his face for a moment. That's the tribulation, right? So Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29. How much sorrow punishments? Suppose ye, shall he be thought worthy, who have trodden under foot the Son of God, and have counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing. So the church, coming into the Great Tribulation, we read about the falling away, the apostasy. And the whole body, I propose, is under the wrath of God because God is not bringing revelation at that time. For the believers, doesn't mean that they lost their salvation, but rather they are being brought through the what? What kind of time is that for them? Remember, I will bring the third part through the fire. God is going to try the elect, and they have to be patient. Psalm 119, verse 118, Thou hast trodden down all them that err from thy statutes. Ultimately, God bringing judgment on Babylon, on the church. That too, I believe, is looked at as the temple itself is trodden down. Okay, so Thou hast trodden down all them that err from thy statutes. For truth. Hi, welcome. And then we know this verse, Revelation 11, verse 2. But the court which is without the temple leave out, measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. Okay, so can we see a pattern here? What I'm offering is that for the body to be trodden underfoot, it initiates the Great Tribulation. What does it mean, 42 months? 42 months. Did you know that 42, let me go ahead and post that, is a half of 7? 42 months, right? 3.5 years. And the tribulation, I believe, is pictured as 7, not 7 literal years, but 7 spiritual years, typified by the 7 years of famine that came on the land of Egypt in the time of Joseph, right? So the number 7, given the proper context, the perfect 7 is looking at the day of the Lord, God's judgment, but yet the tribulation is broken down into what? It's broken down into 2 parts, isn't it? Not equal halves. Spiritually, it is said to be equal. But when we look at some of the numbers and how they tie in, Lord willing, to the timeline, and I think there too, I don't think it's a coincidence that we see the falling away and the judgment that is taking place today. The fact that it falls, or it lines up very nicely with this time period. Okay, so 42 months, the holy city shall they tread underfoot. Now a couple of other verses I think relate. Hold on one second. Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. Now the word days here is more often translated evening. Okay, and he said unto me, under 2,300 days. That's 2,300 evenings, or evening, morning. It's translated more often even, evening, or night. And then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. The idea of cleansing the sanctuary, we're not going to spend time on it now, but I think that's looking at God's judgment on Babylon. Cleansing the sanctuary, I think, has everything to do with the death of the church. But notice here that 2,300 evenings, 2,300 days, what number stand out here? The number 23, right? The number 23. And I think when we look at the rest of the Bible, God, it seems he has a lot to say about the number 23. The number 23 seems to always be pointing to judgment, to tribulation. Well, that's not surprising. You know, I said before that the number 7 points to the Great Tribulation. Does it mean that we only have to search the Bible for the number 7 to tie it into the Great Tribulation? No. God, I believe he can use the number 5, like we read in Revelation 9, the number 3 or 3.5. All of these, somehow, I believe they carry the gospel. They carry the gospel. So given the context, and the tribulation or the day of the Lord is made up of the judgment that begins at the house of God, and then it transitions into the rest of the church, the rest of the body. So 2,300 days, that's 23, right? That's a prime number, very important number, I think, in the Bible. We see it quite a bit. In Daniel, here's another reference. This is just to show for comparison. Times and a half. Now again, I'm not going to spend too much time on these here. Perhaps, Lord willing, another time we can look at it a little bit more closely. But times and a half, that too is a half of 7, right? Because the time there, the year, Christ came to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And I think the Bible, if we follow the pattern in the numbers, not 365 days, but rather 360. So time times 2 times 360, and then half of 360 is 1260, or 3.5 years. But given the context I mentioned before, we could be looking at the judgment that comes on the church as 3.5 years, as 1260 days, as 42 months, or the salvation or the redemption of the elect as 1260, like we read about the woman being fed in the wilderness, or 42 months, or 3.5 again. So this time period here, again, I propose it is tying in to the holy city being trodden down underfoot 40 and 2 months. And the context now where the question is raised was, how long shall be the vision? How long is this going to go on? And then, well, before we get there, let me just go ahead and post one other verse we've been looking at here recently. Daniel chapter 12, verse 11. From the time the daily shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now the 1,290 days, that I don't see to be tying in, excuse me, like these other numbers into a half of 7. But it's another picture, I believe, God gives us of the abomination of desolation. And the main number that is featured there is the number 43. 43 having to do with captivity, right? 430 years. The Israelites, they spent in the wilderness. I'm sorry, in the land of, is that correct? Yeah, 430 years they were in bondage and captivity, and then God delivered them. So, but you know what? I'm going to say this again. I'm going to repeat it, Lord willing, as many times, unless I can see it otherwise. It's very hard to understand the 1,290 and the 1,335 days that we read about in Daniel chapter 12 without understanding the timeline. Very difficult. Because the timeline, I believe, it sets the stage, and we have to look at where these events took place in the timeline and see how they spiritually typified God's judgment on the church. And that's why I mentioned before that the 1,335 or the 1,290 is going to be very difficult to bring any kind of a substance into it without looking at the events themselves relating to the timeline. All right, but we'll come back to that. Right now, though, what I want to try and point out, Lord willing, is the timing of the events, right? The timing of the holy city being trodden down. And now, in this time period here, Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, I believe is pointing to also, it's focusing on the abomination of desolation, except in a different format. Okay, now, evening and morning. I think it's kind of interesting, and I was looking at this last night. It never occurred to me that evening and morning seems to relate to the day of the Lord. And it's kind of interesting how God would put the word evening first and then the word morning, right? Evening and morning. Now, even though morning also could be looking at God's judgment on the church, and I'll see if I can share some verses there, but evening and morning seems to be looking at the great tribulation. In Daniel 8 verse 26, and the vision of the evening and the morning, the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And then going back to Genesis chapter 1, somehow, when God refers to a day as being 24 hours long, notice here, God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. Why start with the evening? Why not the morning? Because that, from our perspective, that's when the days start, right? MT, hi, welcome. Hold on a second. Let me remove this poster for now. From our perspective, when does the day start? The morning, right? You and I, we wake up in the morning, the day comes, and then comes the evening. Then we go back to sleep, we wake up again, and that begins another cycle. But you see, when God was creating the world, for some reason, he seems to be focusing in first on the evening. Evening and the morning were the fifth day, and he makes reference to that as a day. And again, I think we'll see in the Bible, God makes reference to the day as the day of the Lord, right? The ultimate day of the Lord. Genesis 1:23, the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Verse 31, God saw everything that he had made. Behold, it was very good. Evening and the morning were the sixth day. So what I'm going to offer here, and I still have to look at this a little bit, I have to look at it some more, that it would appear that the evening portion of it is the time when darkness comes on the church, on the body of Christ. And then what comes in the morning? What happens in the morning spiritually? And some of the verses that we've looked at before. Exodus 27:21, the tabernacle of the congregation without the veil, which is before the testimony, Aaron and his sons shall order it from evening to morning before the Lord. So the same pattern appears to be in view here again. Psalm 30 verse 5. His anger endureth but a moment, and his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. So that's the salvation aspect of it, I believe. Who is the joy? We know darkness comes on the body of Christ in tribulation. There is no joy. Men are saying peace and safety. So it's a time when God begins to judge Babylon. He begins to judge the church. And then in the morning, when Christ is revealed, we read about the separation. Joy comes in the morning. And that would be, I believe, again, pointing to the redemption or the salvation of the body of Christ. Job chapter 4 verse 20. They are destroyed from morning to evening. Now this is what I mentioned earlier, that somehow God also, it appears, he speaks of a judgment that is coming on the church itself. When we look at the word morning. So it's kind of strange here that they are destroyed from morning to evening. But then when we look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 67, in the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even, and at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. So somehow I believe, and that's why I said, we may have to look at this a little more closely. God does speak of the morning if it's in the context of judging Babylon. Well, that too relates to the separation. But what I find interesting here, again, as I said, because God is using the word evening, 2300 days, or 2300 evening and morning, that's the judgment side of it. That's the time when the lights begin to grow dark. Right? The lights go dark and God hides his face from the body. Okay, any questions so far? Any question? Now we're looking at Daniel chapter 8, and I'm offering right now that the 2300 days, as we know, okay, we've talked about this before, seem to be focusing first of all on the Great Tribulation, typified by 42 months, typified by 1260 days. I don't believe at this time that the 1290 is looking at the well, at least not the historical aspect of it. I'll share some verses, perhaps offering something on the 1290. I don't believe the 1335 though that we read about also in that context of the 1290. I see that as a number that is pointing to the redemption of the body. And we'll talk a little more about that later too. 23. The number 23. Why do I offer that this is talking about God's judgment on the church? Well, we read, for example, and we've seen this verse before, 1 Corinthians 10, verse 8, neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed and fell in one day. 23,000. Okay, is that significant? Do you suppose that that's important? What is the one day there, first of all, that might be in view? One day. Neither. Now, the church typified whom? I'm sorry, the nation of Israel typified the church, right? We read these things were given to us for ensamples upon whom the end of the world is come. So neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed. So God, I believe he is using this account to point to what happens to the church in the day when God judges Babylon. Now going back to Numbers 25, that's the reference. God does not speak of 23. He speaks of 24. Right? 24,000 fell. In verse 8. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent and thrust both of them through the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague, verse 9, were 24,000. Well, is that a contradiction? Is that a conflict? Numbers 25 says 24,000. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 8 says 23,000. And I think what's important here, Lord willing, is the fact that God is also underlining the one day, right? The day of the Lord, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. In 1 hour is thy judgment come. Babylon falls in one day. I will remove the iniquity of the land in one day. That's an interesting verse. Let me see if I can find that. And Zechariah chapter 3 verse 9. See, this is where again I believe God is looking at the day of the Lord. Behold, I will engrave the engraving thereof, saith the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of that land in one day. What day is that? The day of the Lord, right? That's what I believe is in view. But of that day and hour knoweth no man. In that day it shall come to pass in that day. So that's the day of the Lord. 24,000 died in Numbers 25. But here God is underlining the number 23. Why? Well, again, because I believe that the focus is on the judgment that comes on Babylon. Nadab and Abihu died when they offered strange fire before the Lord. Numbers 26:61. And then in verse 62, let me see if I can get that to post. Oops. Hold on one second. Numbers 26 verse 62, and those that were numbered of them were 23,000, all males from a month old and upward. For they were not numbered among the children of Israel. Why? Because there was no inheritance given them among the children of Israel. So there I think that's kind of interesting, because we're looking at those that are not numbered. And I think in this context, again, it is pointing to God's judgment on Babylon. The fact that they're not numbered. You know, we read in Revelation that the 144,000 were sealed. And it's a great multitude which no man could number. But yet here, 23,000 are those that have the inheritance taken away from them. Can you see how spiritually that might be pointing to the judgment on the church, the judgment on Babylon? Now here's a picture of salvation, something also I think we have to, Lord willing, factor in. Acts 27 verse 37. The shipwreck, typifying the great tribulation. And notice those who escaped, 276. Why 276? See the number that's in view there, the number 23. So in other words, in the tribulation, in God's judgment coming on the church, on the body, these would typify the elect who escape this judgment. They come out of Babylon, right? God redeems them. He brings back their captivity. So is the number 23 important? I think it is. Right? Now, let's look at the calendar just a little bit. And I said before, we can dispute the calendar, again and again. But from everything that I'm seeing so far, there's a lot of information that God gives us, a lot of time references, patterns, and we really, Lord willing, would have to sit back and actually analyze them and see how they relate, right? The time patterns, the duration of certain events, and how these would seem to tie into the spiritual, that is God's judgment on Israel, as well as what's going on in the church today. 11,013. And by the way, I'm not going to get into details here. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand, or we can get back to it later on. But I just want to, as an aside, I want to share this information because I do see the Bible to be sharing that, and also try to relate, Lord willing, how it might tie in to what we see happening today, both historically as well as spiritually. 11,013 BC, That's the number that I've looked at again and again. Not able to fault it right now in terms of how these might tie into the overall time frame or the picture of the history of the world. Now notice here how the number 23 again is in view, right? 4990 BC, the year of the flood, exactly 6,023 years. 1113 to 2011. They say, wait a minute, 2011, well, that's already passed. Yeah, it has passed, right? It's already passed. And that's one reason there was a big campaign. There was a big, tremendous hype, which I believe that somehow God had set up as a test, because there's some additional information in the Bible. God speaks of the days being shortened. He speaks of cutting the time short. He speaks of Christ being revealed. And then, by God's grace, I think we come to understand, we come to learn that this is the judgment that comes on the church. Not something that was anticipating the very last day, but rather the day of the Lord, where God would avenge the blood of the martyrs. It began with the killing of the two witnesses, and it transitioned with the death of the body, separation of wheat and tares. Now again, I believe that officially, from everything that I can see so far, 1994 would have been the key date, the key year. I'm not really interested in exactly when in 1994, although we might find some information relating to that. But when it comes to 2011, no. There's no substance there. I'm sorry, there's no substance there, even though the timeline, the way it seems it was originally designed to bring us to 2011, but God, it seemed, He stepped off the calendar when Christ was revealed. Why? Because those numbers, those patterns, the prophecies, while the numbers are there, they would be pointing to the day of the Lord, that is the revelation of Christ. So if Christ has been revealed, then today I don't believe that we can place or we can put any substance in anything relating to the post or post-tribulation. That makes sense? Anything after the revelation of Christ. But yet the pattern is still there. And I think what some people perhaps might be overlooking is the fact that, and we're going to look at that section here right after this, the fact that God shortened the days. That's interpreted somewhat differently when they start looking at the great multitude. But here we see 23 years, 4990 BC, 11,013, 11,013, 2011, 13,023 years, 609 BC, the death of Josiah. If we go back in 2 Chronicles, I think we'll see perhaps that is, or it was, a picture of the church coming into the Great Tribulation. And that lasted 23 years, inclusive. 23 years. Uh, 4990 BC to the cross, 33 AD, 5,023 years. Wow. Well, that's kind of interesting again. It could be a coincidence. Yeah, it could be, but I don't believe it is, right? Because I think by God's grace, some of us, or myself, I could go back and double check some of the information, look at Genesis 5 and 11, and see whether or not there's anything that might not be consistent. 33 AD, 1988, the number 23, again, there appears to be in view. And one other, yeah, and we know that 88 to 2011 was the 23 years that most people were focusing on. But let me go ahead and post that. As I said, I'm not going to spend time, looking at or trying to explain or analyze the calendar right now. Just wanted to, because we're looking at the number 23, how long shall be the vision? And it was said 2300 evening and morning, 2300 days, and then the sanctuary would be cleansed. So I think it's kind of interesting that we do see how the 23, it seems, it repeats a number of times in the context of the day of the Lord. And now we come to the shortening of the days. And one thing I think is very interesting here, we're going to look at, I'm going to offer some verses. Judgment on the wicked. The fact that the days are shortened, it is pointing to God's judgment on Babylon. But it also, I believe, again, it is pointing to a physical or historical time reference. Why? Well, the reason I say that is because God in the past, He has given us this pattern. He has given us the 430 years. He has given us, the other events that would seem to indicate or seem to tie in the numbers to the gospel. So the days are shortened, God's judgment on the wicked. Let me go back to Daniel chapter 8. Almost done. That's the last section. Daniel chapter 8, verse 13. So how long shall be the vision? This reminds me of the verse we read in Revelation 6, right? How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? So how long shall be the vision? To give both a sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days or evenings, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. For then shall be great tribulation, Matthew 24:21, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened. That's the missing element, I believe. That's the point of separation. That's the point of division. So in other words, even though there's a perfect 23, a perfect 7, the latter portion of it, we see this also when Christ was revealed. If we look at the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, we see this again, I propose, in the 7-year tribulation coming on the church. The latter portion of that tribulation, it disappears. There's no information regarding that because God intervened. He cut those days short so that now it is the day of the Lord. Judgment has come on the body, and all of this prophecy, looking at the numbers, these would have been fulfilled at the time when God or Christ was revealed. So except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. We see the same thing again in Mark 13, verse 20. Except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. And I don't believe here that this is talking about the great multitude of the latter rain, right? You've probably heard this. The great multitude, these are the ones that are being saved outside of the building, outside of the local churches. No. Salvation that's in view there, I believe, it is the redemption of the body. Jacob's trouble, but he would be saved out of it. So that multitude that is coming out of the Great Tribulation, I don't think it's looking at unsaved people that never were a part of the kingdom, and now they're coming out of the tribulation. That's the way we read that. I think some might read that on the surface. But that would not seem to tie in, Lord willing, with the rest of the Bible. Because to come out of tribulation, you'd have to be in tribulation. And the church, right, the church was the body that was experiencing this tribulation. Until God now, He cut the day short. And then He begins to, the command comes, Babylon is fallen. Come out of her, my people. That's coming out of tribulation, right? come out of her my people, not someone who's already unsaved or who had been unsaved. So except the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he hath chosen, he hath shortened the days. Now, I mentioned just now, what I find interesting here is some of these verses. Psalm 89:45. The days of his youth hast thou shortened. That's judgment on Babylon, right? God cut the wicked short. He shortened their days. Well, yeah, that's spiritual. Psalm 102, verse 23. He weakened my strength in the way, he shortened my days. Same thing. Proverbs 10, verse 27. The fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. Okay, now we can look at these verses and we understand that this is talking about God's judgment coming on Babylon. But does it mean that, okay, now we see that this is spiritual and automatically now we can discard anything having to do with time information that God would also reveal in the Bible? And my answer to that again is no. Because just because something is spiritual, it doesn't mean now that we discard or set aside anything else. That's just pretty much the same if you think about it. When we look at the thieves, we look at the spiritual nature of God's judgment on Babylon. Thou shalt not kill. Okay, well, if that's spiritual, we understand that that has to do with the killing of the two witnesses. That doesn't give us a license now to kill someone, because the moral aspect of the law, I believe, would still be in effect, right? We understand that God is also working in the sense that, yeah, you do something, you sin, you kill someone, you commit adultery, any of that, because it's spiritual, doesn't set aside the moral aspect of the law. And now, especially, as I mentioned before, with so much time information that we find in the Bible, I think it's also important, Lord willing, that we look at them very carefully and see whether or not there's anything that could be developed there. So, the fear of the Lord prolongeth days, but the years of the wicked shall be shortened. So this language, I believe, is spiritual, and also given the timeline, as I mentioned before, looking at the 2300 days, the tribulation itself, and how these dates might come into being, certainly, Lord willing, there has to be something spiritual there also, in terms of how these dates or the time might relate to what's going on today. Okay, now on the websites, I also posted, I'm not going to get into that right now, but I'll just put the link up there. It doesn't want to post. If you go to the chart section on the Berean Studies website, just look at 2300 evening and morning, and there I think is a breakdown of the actual timing or the days that would lead up to 1994. We've talked about this before, so as I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We don't have to accept anything that anyone might have to offer, but I think it's important, again, Lord willing, that we want to try to at least consider the information there. Alright, let me go ahead and post a very short conclusion, and then we'll open for discussion. So the number 23, and all I have to say here again is that, first of all, we know that it is relating to judgment, both historically as it relates to the timeline, as well as the spiritual judgment on Babylon, on the wicked. The 2300 days seem to point to the day of the Lord. Yeah, originally it was going to be 23, but then God cut it short while he still underlined the number 23. 2300 days, 2300 evening and morning, spiritual as well as historically, as I mentioned before. Okay, hold on one second.